My name is Juliet Anderson, and I'm 28 years old. I was 7 the first time my father called me a liar in front of everyone. We were celebrating my aunt's birthday over dinner, and I accidentally tipped over a glass of juice. I explained that it had slipped from my hand. He glanced around at the table filled with relatives and said, "She always says that. It's never her fault." Everyone laughed. I didn't. That moment planted something inside me. A quiet, bone-deep realization that no matter what I said or how hard I tried, my parents had already decided who I was, and for the next 21 years, I did everything I could to prove them wrong. I dressed the way they approved of. I measured every word I spoke. I apologized first, even when I had done absolutely nothing wrong. I reshaped myself into someone I barely recognized, just to earn a kind of love that always stayed just out of reach. Then I met Callum Reed. He was 31, a civil engineer with calm hands and an even calmer heart. We met at a rooftop fundraiser 3 years earlier. He had come with a coworker. I was attending for a client. Within 4 minutes of meeting me, he accidentally spilled his drink all over my jacket, then apologized with such genuine sincerity that I laughed instead of pulling away. By the time the evening ended, we had exchanged phone numbers and shared a conversation that felt like breathing again after holding my breath for years. He never expected me to make myself smaller. He never pulled back when I spoke honestly. He asked thoughtful questions and truly listened to every answer. After 14 months together, he proposed in the kitchen of our apartment. There was no elaborate display, only him kneeling with a ring his grandmother had left behind and his voice trembling slightly as he said my name. I said yes before he could even finish asking. We planned our wedding for a Saturday in late September. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for the Friday evening before, in a private room at a restaurant called Brennan's. Candles filled the room. The people closest to us would gather to celebrate the first time in my life I truly felt chosen. My parents had never approved of Callum. My father, Leonard Anderson, believed he was too quiet, too reserved, and not impressive enough according to the impossible standards he carried around in his mind like an accounting book. My mother, Patricia, smiled warmly whenever Callum was present, then quietly criticized him the moment he stepped out of the room. By then, I had spent years keeping their opinions at arm's length. I had learned how to tune them out. But 14 days before my wedding, they crossed a line I couldn't ignore. Callum phoned me on a Tuesday afternoon, and something in his voice had changed. He wasn't angry. He sounded careful, as though he was holding something fragile and didn't know how tightly he could hold on to it. He told me my parents had shown up at his office. Without saying a word to me beforehand, without any warning, they sat across from him and claimed that I had gotten pregnant when I was 22, that I had given birth to a child, and that I had abandoned that baby. They said I had simply walked away without ever looking back. My father even used the word bastard. My mother leaned in and whispered as though they were sharing a secret. "Don't let her trap you too." Callum didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse me of anything. He simply asked, very quietly, if there was something I needed to tell him. I sat alone inside my car in a parking garage with my phone pressed tightly against my ear, and it felt as though the center of my chest had completely collapsed into emptiness because there had been a child. But the truth was nothing like the story my parents had told him. When I was 22, I had been involved with a man named Sebastian Cole. He was older, charming in the way that often hides control beneath expensive clothes and polished words. I became pregnant. I was terrified. Sebastian wasn't compassionate about it. He made it clear he didn't want the baby. When I admitted I didn't know what I wanted, he slowly made my own feelings seem smaller and less important, until I felt as though I had nowhere left to stand. I carried that pregnancy for 4 months before a miscarriage ended everything. It happened suddenly. It devastated me, and it was completely beyond my control. There was never a birth. There was never a baby I abandoned. There was only grief that I buried so deeply I had spoken about it with almost no one, including Callum, because I had never found the right time, and because that chapter of my life belonged to a version of myself I had spent years silently grieving. My parents knew every bit of that. My mother had been there. She drove me to the hospital herself. She sat beside me in the waiting room, holding my hand. She knew exactly what had happened, and exactly what had never happened. Yet 14 days before my wedding, she sat across from my fiancé and told him I had abandoned a living child. That night, I drove to Callum's apartment and told him everything. I told him about the pregnancy, the miscarriage, Sebastian, and the silence I had carried for so many years. He listened, without interrupting once. When I finished, he reached across the table, took my hand, and quietly said, "I'm so sorry that happened to you." Not, "I'm sorry you never told me." Not, "I'm not sure I believe you." Before asking a single question, he mourned the loss with me. That was the man I was going to marry. But the damage my parents had created was still sitting between us. I understood it would not simply disappear, because Callum was a good man. My parents had planned for that. They knew that if they planted a seed of doubt close enough to the wedding, it could crack something open that even love might never completely repair. What they never planned for was who would walk through the doors of our rehearsal dinner the following Friday, and what she would bring with her. The rehearsal dinner was meant to be the peaceful moment before the beautiful chaos of our wedding day. Brennan's restaurant had been transformed into something that looked almost magical. Warm amber lights stretched across the exposed brick walls. Long tables were covered in cream-colored linen with eucalyptus runners. Candles flickered inside glass holders that reflected soft light across the faces of the people we cared about most. Callum stood near the bar with his brother, laughing at something, his collar unbuttoned, his eyes finding mine every few minutes across the room, the way they always had, as if making sure I was still there. For a brief moment, standing in the doorway, wearing my navy dress, I almost convinced myself the previous 2 weeks had never happened, that my parents had never done what they did, that the wound had already begun to heal. My parents were sitting at the far end of the table. My father was already on his second drink. My mother wore a pale rose blouse, and the familiar expression she always saved for events where photographs would be taken, calm, pleasant, carefully performing kindness for people who had never truly known her. They had called me twice after their confrontation with Callum. I never answered either call. They came tonight because I still hadn't found the words to tell them they were no longer welcome, and because some tired part of me had hoped they would simply remain quiet and allow the evening to pass peacefully. That hope ended at exactly 8:17 that evening, when the door to Brennan's private dining room opened, and a woman stepped inside whom I had not seen in 6 years. Her name was Nora Voss. She was 34, slender and composed, with dark eyes and the quiet confidence of someone who had survived something life-changing. She had been my closest friend during the years I was involved with Sebastian Cole. She had held me together after the miscarriage, with a strength I had never properly thanked her for. Over time, we had slowly drifted apart, not because of anger, but because sometimes two people become reminders of a pain neither wants to keep revisiting. I had no idea she was coming. I hadn't invited her. In those first few moments after seeing her, I couldn't understand why she was there. She walked straight toward me, ignoring the greetings and the confused looks around the room, and spoke my name in a voice that was calm but serious. She was carrying a manila envelope. She told me she needed 5 minutes and that it couldn't wait. I led her into the narrow hallway outside the dining room. The sounds of the celebration became muted once the door closed behind us. She placed the envelope into my hands and told me to open it. Inside were documents, medical records from the hospital where I had been treated after the miscarriage, a dated discharge summary, a formal letter from the attending physician confirming, in clear clinical language, that the pregnancy had ended at 17 weeks. Beneath those papers was a printed collection of text messages, screenshots with visible timestamps exchanged between my mother, Patricia Anderson, and Sebastian Cole. The earliest message had been sent 3 months before. In it, my mother contacted Sebastian directly. She asked him to confirm, if anyone ever questioned it, that I had given birth to a living child and secretly placed that baby up for adoption without ever telling him. To Sebastian's credit, he refused. He replied that nothing like that had happened and that he wanted absolutely no involvement. My mother tried again 2 more times. He eventually stopped replying. Nora had obtained those messages because Sebastian, uncomfortable with the entire exchange, had reached out to her. They had remained loosely connected over the years, and she had driven for hours to make sure I received them before I stood at any altar. I stood in that hallway for a long moment with the papers in my hands, feeling something very quiet settle in the center of my chest. It wasn't exactly anger, it was something older and more complete than anger. It was the unique grief that comes from finally holding proof of something you had always known but could never speak aloud. That your parents were not simply flawed or afraid, but intentionally, deliberately cruel in a way that had nothing to do with protecting you and everything to do with controlling the direction of your life. I walked back into the dining room. Callum read my expression before I spoke a single word and came to stand beside me without me asking. I placed the envelope on the table in front of my father and mother, in front of our guests, beneath the candlelight, the eucalyptus, and inside the beautiful room that had been meant only for celebration. I never raised my voice. I had spent far too many years shouting into empty rooms to waste the quiet strength I had finally found. Calmly and without drama, I explained exactly what the documents contained. I told everyone gathered there what my parents had tried to do 14 days before my wedding. My father's jaw clenched. My mother stared down at the tablecloth. Neither of them said a word. I asked them to leave. They did. The room remained silent for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Then, Callum's mother, a woman named Frances, who had never shown me anything except kindness, slowly stood and began to clap. At first, it was only her. Then the entire table joined in. I stood there beneath the warm amber lights of Brennan's, with my fiancé's hand wrapped around mine and Nora, across the table watching me with tears in her eyes, and I let the applause wash over every year I had spent being called a liar, in rooms where no one had ever defended me. We were married that Saturday. The ceremony was intimate, genuine, and completely ours. My parents were not there. That wasn't a tragedy. It was a boundary I had finally stopped apologizing for. Callum cried while saying his vows. I waited until he finished before I cried through mine. Nora sat in the front row and handed me a tissue at exactly the right moment, just as she always had. My name is Juliet Anderson, soon to become Juliet Reed, and I am 28 years old. I spent most of those years believing that the people who were supposed to love me without conditions had somehow received a version of me that deserved less. I know now that was never true. Some people don't stop trying to control you because they suddenly change. They stop because you finally step beyond their reach and build something so strong and so genuine that their words no longer have a place to echo. If this story reached a part of you, if you've ever sat in a room while someone rewrote your truth and nobody stood up for you, I want you to know that the rehearsal dinner is not the ending of your story. Sometimes it's the very place where your real life begins. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel. Every story we share is for someone who needed to hear it today. Tap that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and come back for the next story, because the best chapters are always still waiting ahead.